All right, welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown Season 2. They have let us come back for another season. Amazing stuff. If you're new to the show, this is the podcast that looks at everything about Celtic, but with a focus on the performance, the XG, and everything is going to be backed up by the numbers. The brains of the podcast are with me as always. That is Alan Morrison, aka Celtic by Numbers. Alan, how are you getting on?
Yeah, good, thanks. Welcome back.
And Jiko James as well, aka Jiko James.
Hey guys.
James, how are you?
I'm all right. Good to see you.
So we've got a lot to get to on the show today. It's been a busy couple of weeks, a busy couple of days in the transfer market as well. Carl Starfelt seems to be about to sign for Celtic. He's undergoing a medical. That's according to all reports today. We're going to be talking about the rebuild so far, other potential signings on the way. We have had 2 preseason games so far, another one tonight. So we're going to sort of look at the general themes from those couple of games and what Big Ange is implementing so far in those games. I know they are preseason games, so there is a bit of an asterisk beside them, but we're going to talk about the sort of the themes on the pitch. And the Champions League is coming up next week against FC Midfield, so we're going to see how we're fixed with that. So let's start with the news of the day. That's Carl Starfelt. Seems to be on his way to Celtic. Seems that it is imminently about to be announced, and there could be another couple of ones on the way in the next couple of days as well. James, Starfelt seems to be the man. It seems like Mario Vuskovic is no longer coming to the club. It seems like Starfelt is the guy that Celtic are going to have as centre back. You've been looking at him today on Twitter, I see.
Yeah, so the very fascinating player, actually. So just from a data perspective, I've seen very little of him actually in video. So the profile is one of as I described him in a thread I did, he's an animal. I mean, he's an animal. That's good, meaning that he's very efficient and effective in tackle, in dueling. When he engages with an attacking player, the vast majority of the time he's winning that battle from open play specifically. His effectiveness in the air is in a defensive perspective is not as dominant. He's probably a little bit towards mediocre, or maybe even a smidge below that from an aerial perspective. And I think he's 6'1", something like that. So again, not all of that surprising given that profile. So that's encouraging. And he's 26, I believe. I think he just turned 26, so he's kind of right in his athletic prime. Played at a good level, was very good in Sweden, and then into the Russian league's a pretty good league. Played on a decent team. I mean, I think they ended up 4th in the Russian league. So, they had a decent amount of the ball. It wasn't like they had their backs to the wall and he was defending the whole time. So, a decent blend of performance data that's reliable, meaning that he's got a lot of it and not played on really bad sides, or there's nothing quixotic that makes it a little bit more difficult to normalize his performance data. The other part that jumps out to me is he's very efficient in his passing, but he's quite safe. That's not good or bad. It's just a profile issue. And again, I'm not going to presume to have a good sense of what Ange Postecoglou wants out of his defenders. That's he's far more of an expert on Ange than I am. So I think he's different than Vuskovic. There's no question. Vuskovic was almost like the opposite. Vuskovic, his profile is one of a really adept deep lying playmaker as a center back, where his defensive metrics were good, but they didn't stand out. Whereas I'd say Starfelt's more of an elite open play defender with safe passing, efficient. He doesn't give the ball away a lot, but he's not going to do much, it doesn't appear, as far as breaking lines, progressing the ball, kind of those line splitting passes that Al and I always talk about. So I think relative to the fit of the puzzle, that's where I'm curious, how he pairs with a Julian. Where are we getting that deep lying playmaking, ball progression from? Barkas is playing a different role. I mean, there's a whole new puzzle here. That's the fun part, sweeper keepers, and we'll get into that when we talk about some of the play and the friendly so far, about how Soro is being utilized, that kind of thing. So There's a lot there. So that's the first part. I mean, there's a lot of good aspects that look like, if coherently used, could really contribute to, the team in a positive way.
Yeah, the aerial impact is an interesting one, because for those of you who are new to this show, I'm the guy who doesn't know anything about numbers on it, but I'm going to try this year. I'm going to give my best go at learning how to use Scout and seeing what it's like. And the first thing that jumped out to me when I looked at Starfelt's profile was his low numbers in aerial duels. So it wouldn't be like Celtic if they weren't buying a centre back who is very, very weak in the air. So that seems to be the way the Starfelt is. Interesting that he's 26, because again, looking at him, I'm 26. And he looks way more than a man than I'll ever look. So I think that's another thing that's standing out to me from Starfelt. I actually haven't seen him play all that much. If you are watching on YouTube, do leave a comment below it. There's a couple of comments coming in here. We'll get to them a little later on. Thank you to Marco, who has also left a super chat as well. We'll get to all your comments in just a sec. Alan, your early thoughts on the Starfelt signing, or the soon-to-be signing, and the sort of model of the player that he seems to be?
So, with the sort of Celtic, internet is evolving all the time, and what we're seeing now is, with like this, I'm going to name check Cynic Analysis and Boys Analytics and James himself. As soon as a name hits the ether, slightest bit of, a scout once went to watch this guy, we've now got 3 lots of analysis hitting the airwaves, and it's fantastic. So we're now got all this data on these guys that we would never have had before. So I think it's brilliant. Because, and again, just for people that may not know, the data I have is my own. So I don't have data on Starfelt because I can't watch every game on the planet. So it come to me for Celtic numbers, but not so much for Ruben Kazan. So great, it's great the guys have got access to things like Scout and so forth. So what I've read from the people that have done the hard work and done pulled together some great analysis online is, I'm super excited about this guy. I think he looks absolutely top notch for what we need. The aerial duel issue. Okay, let's see. I mean, is he being overpowered? You might not win cleanly every ball, but if you're messing up the attacker sufficiently, if you're positioned well, if you're avoiding duels, if you're pushing the forward under the ball, and therefore you don't even have a duel, all these sort of things need to come into it, which we can only really glean from watching the guy. And Stephen Welsh was probably quite similar in that regard. And the reason that I segued to Welsh is to cover this sort of passing question that James raised, or the little flag perhaps. So I'm one of these people that finds passing statistics interesting. A lot of people say, passing statistics are meaningless, but it's like any stat. If you give it context and you analyze it properly, it all has meaning. And given that passing, represents over 75% of all actions on the pitch, passing stats to me are pretty important, right? So I'm going to give you an example. So, which centre back has the highest pass completion percentage of any recent? And to say recent, I'm going back, say 6-7 seasons. The highest percentage completion pass rate of any centre back in the last 7 years. Guess who that would be?
Go ahead, and you do it.
From Celtic only, is it?
Yeah, from Celtic.
Yeah. I'm going to go with Virgil van Dijk conservatively.
Okay,
but I don't think it is.
James?
Yeah, I'm going to say probably Duffy.
Okay, so yeah, both wrong. Listen, it's Boyata, right?
Boyata,
now the reason it's Boyata completed 96% of his passes. You could conclude from that Boyata's a great passer of the ball. In fact, the opposite is true. He was the worst passer that Celtic had, and therefore his instruction was to give it as simply and as short to the nearest Celtic player as you possibly could. So these passing numbers could indicate that Starfelt isn't a great passer, and actually he needs to just give the ball to someone else as quickly as possible. Or and this was the Stephen Welsh segue, we could look at Stephen Welsh's example. Now, if you look at, I don't know how Scout defines, I meant to look it up, I didn't have time, how Scout defines a progressive pass. And I don't know where Welsh sits on progressive pass stats in terms of the benchmark. But certainly from my perspective, in terms of creative key passes, so passes that lead to chances, he's like near the bottom of Celtic centre-halves. And yet he's at the top of Celtic centre-halves in the last 7 years when it comes to what I call pack passes. So these are passes that are forward, find a Celtic player and take opponents out of the game. And he averaged 11 per game. No other Celtic player has come near that in recent years. Julian, who's known for his quite progressive passing, averages about 8.5 pack passes a game. And Welsh is up at 11, which is only just behind Callum McGregor, who leads for the whole squad. So what I'm interested to see is, and because Y-Scout and others don't do packing data, and I think it's incredibly valuable, is whether actually what Starfelt will give you is his passes will break that initial press, that initial forward-orientated press. So he may not be taking out any defenders, he may not be taking out a lot of players, but if he's taking out that initial press and progressing the ball into midfield, that's a big tick for me, and I don't care that somebody might say he doesn't have any progressive passes. To me, that's worth its weight, because that then starts to build the game for Celtic.
Yeah, well, if you're looking at a player, and I know they're completely different players, completely different positions, but Bruno Fernandes for me is someone who stands out as someone who takes risks with the ball. He tries to play the killer pass more often than not, more often than, say, a Pedri does for Barcelona. He tries to play through the lines as much as possible, gives the ball away a lot more, but that's his job. Whereas a defender for me, a centre back for me, is get the ball, start the attack, and you're done. Either you're carrying the ball into midfield like Christopher Ayer does, or you're giving the ball into the centre mids to do their job and carry the ball forward. There are a couple of comments coming in, and one thing I do want to touch on is this comment from Marco saying we will still need a centre back with Starfelt coming in, right? So Celtic have.
This is where we're going to fight, Alan. Get ready to fight, Alan. You ready?
This has been something that people have been talking about, and it seems the theme is that Mario Vuskovic is not coming now, that it is Starfelt instead. Celtic have signed Osias Urquide from Sheffield Wednesday. He is a centre-back by nature, could play right-back as well. Do Celtic need another centre-back? Because it seems like Christopher Ayer is out the door if they can finally get the Starfelt thing over the line.
I think it's a matter of need versus want, how resources are allocated and what's a reasonable expectation. So I think it's plausible that they won't sign another one. And that's for two main reasons. One is extremely controversial, one probably not so much. I think Beaton actually profiles pretty well for Ange's system, particularly from, if we think about in this, as Alan said, with some of the resources that of fellow analysts online, it's pretty easy to learn stuff and scale your knowledge base by reading other people's work. So Boys Analytics, Ross Goodwin has done some really great work on looking at Ange in his time at Marinos and even before that. And if you look at how he's played, for the most part, he keeps his center backs fairly deep, kind of around the halfway line or just inside the defensive half, which is a place for someone who can recycle the ball, as Alan was saying, someone who's conservative and can pass it on to somebody who's, going to distribute the ball. Beaton can do that from that position. And when you're talking about, 8 of our 11 domestic competitors, that is a huge, valuable skill. And not only from a deep line playmaking, but he has and there's some downside risk to this as well. So again, I'm not claiming that Nir Beton is the greatest defender that ever lived, but he came up as a number 6, and there's and he's a smart player. So if you look at his interception stats, for example, he's always been good at intercepting passes and anticipating and kind of closing down space like a midfielder does. So if you're talking about a center back in a high press system in a high line who's basically attack, try to get the ball back, move it quickly to attack again, I think he profiles very positively in that context. And if he's going to be playing next to a guy like Starfelt, who's an animal defensively, to me, that's a pretty good complementary pairing that would highlight what Beaton's good at and complement with somebody who helps with his deficiencies. The second part I'll add, which is probably not controversial, and I don't think this has been released publicly. I think I'm 99% sure it's true, which is Celtic have invested in a software package, or not package, but a company that offers a service that does artificial intelligence or machine learning for fitness. Basically, how do you help your players stay fit? And a guy like Beaton can benefit from that, who has had chronic kind of soft tissue. This particularly helps with soft tissue, hamstrings, quads, calves. And they've had, teams like Getafe. There's a case study that Getafe in this La Liga, who were one of the first teams that adopted this, had their injury rate drop 75, 80%. And when you're talking about, I think, and I was advocating for this, I talked to some people. I mean, this was such an obvious move for Celtic to make, not only because they need it, because Rangers invested in it last season. And if you look at their injury data relative to ours last season, they were dramatically better, and particularly in the soft tissue space. And so I don't think that was luck. I think it was because they were smart and invested in this system. But also, if you just think about how Ange plays, this is going to be incredibly demanding on players physically. This attack, high press, counter press. I mean, we'll talk about it when we get into discussing the friendly so far. But as exciting as that is incredibly draining physically. And I'm not a sports science person. I'm barely an athlete. But to me, that would raise risks of soft tissue injuries.
Yeah, it definitely would. And I think injuries are something that people are starting to get more and more aware of, the importance of keeping players fit, especially as the demands increase. And one of the first teams to introduce cryotherapy, and I know cryotherapy is completely commonplace now, but it wasn't when Leicester won the league. And I remember reading about how Leicester had invested heavily on these cryo tanks. And Leicester, believe it or not, had the least amount of injuries. I'm not saying that was solely down to cryotherapy, but it was largely down to it. It definitely didn't hurt. Definitely didn't hurt their title challenge that year as well.
And what this does is it basically takes, you see the players that wear those catapult bras, right? Mm-hmm. And players are having their vitals tested regularly. They get, their BMI, their blood sugar, all this stuff. The teams are collecting all of this data, right? And up until now, for the most part, they've been spitballing it, right? So it's just the same as a doctor 100 years ago. I mean, was the art of medicine. That's why they call it the art of medicine, is that they didn't have the statistics and the data that we had now. But even then, if you have volume of data and you're not processing it, if you have big data, you have all this data, what do you do with it? How do you interpret it? And basically what this company does is it uses machine learning algorithms to take massive amounts of data from all of these teams, right? All of the teams, and they crowdsource it and basically take all the vitals, all of this information being collected, and try to look for, okay, when does a player get injured, right? What's the injury history and what precedes it? And then that creates flags. So you're going to get a warning sign in training and say, okay, this guy has a flag now. Let's give him a couple of days off so that, or, adjust his regime or do something with his cooling off. Again, I don't know the specifics on all this, but have a plan to prevent the injury. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's the preventative part of it, which is and using that big data. So the stuff that you're talking about, and is absolutely part, the therapy and stretching. Guys have used yoga. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that athletes have used historically to get, improve these things. What's different about this is it's basically using the algorithms with big data. And that's kind of the next generation of all of this. And this is not widely used yet. So again, this is a competitive advantage, not only that we need to catch up with Rangers, but it's probably going to give us a little bit of an advantage within the context of Europe, compared to other teams that aren't deploying it yet. But as I've talked about all of this, it's like an S curve. It's an industry S curve in innovation. And the earlier you get the advantage, the longer you're going to have it until everyone plays catch up. Yeah. Right. So Rangers have a year on us. We're going to catch up to them quick. And then probably over the next 3 to 5 years, more and more of our competitors in Europe are going to start adopting too. Let's, enjoy the advantage while we have it.
Before we finish up on the defense and move on to potential other signings, I do want to get your thoughts on this, Alan. A question that has come in from Tony McLaughlin, which I think is the same Tony McLaughlin that does stats on Twitter as well, basically asking about Welsh and his progression. But Murray and Enda obviously is back at the club now. He's an option at centre back as well. I think he did quite well out on loan last season. So, I mean, we joked on the show that we potentially could have Ralston, Welsh, Beaton, and Greg Taylor starting in this Champions League game. If I'm not so sure Starfelt is actually going to play against Midfield next week. I can't see how he comes into the team and immediately stamps down his place for that game. But Enda has played in the preseason games, Murray as well. So what are your thoughts in there? Are they potential options that they could come in and stamp their authority this year?
Well, I've seen very little of them, especially Murray. There was just the appearance in the friendlies. It was the first I'd ever seen of him, in all honesty. So difficult to say, really. But what I would say, I'd agree with James, is that we've actually, in terms of sheer numbers, now got quite a lot of bodies in that department, right? So you've now got, on the face of it, Starfelt signs and Julian. You're looking at them as your first choice. And then behind that, you've got Welsh and Beaton, and then behind that, you've got Urugidi, and then potentially Hilda and Murray. That's probably more bodies, enough bodies in a sense, really. So I would be very, I would think we wouldn't sign any more centre halves, to your original question. I guess I'm going to have to concede defeat in the Beaton isn't a centre half debate. I'm just not going to win that one. So this is where the club clearly see him, and that's where he's played for the last couple of years. So got to get on with that. And for those of you that are maybe new to the show, what my performance numbers show with Beaton is that he's absolutely, in fact, he's a real asset playing centre back against 10 out of 11 opponents in the SPFL, and some minnow teams in qualification for Europe. But you put him up against anybody that's of any quality at centre back, and it's not going to end well, unfortunately. With Welsh, to Tony's question, I got more and more optimistic week on week with Welsh. If you look at his pure defending numbers, he plots probably not so well compared to the likes of Ayer and Julian, and obviously Van Dijk and Benkovic and people like that who posted really excellent defensive duel numbers and in number of interceptions, and that's really mainly down to his aerial, his general lack of kind of ability aerially, and I think we've seen with Welsh is more of a physical thing. He's just not a very tall man. Starfelt's got decent height, and as I say, I'll reserve judgment on his aerial success duels until we actually see the guy. But what Welsh developed and actually developed very noticeably is what I've touched on before, which is his ability to progress the ball to such an extent that, as I say, his passing numbers from a packing perspective, again, packing is important because it's not just about covering yards with the ball. It actually means you're taking opponents out the game, which means they're now behind the ball and not defending their goal. It's really important. His packing numbers are second only to McGregor, and that came from very humble beginnings when he was first in the team, and then developed as he went through. So on that basis, and also the fact that he's a relatively mobile defender, Welsh, he's not particularly devastatingly quick, but he's mobile enough, suggests to me that in a Postecoglou setup, he would do okay. Sure, there would be reservations. Hilda, is 17. I'm not going to sort of overanalyze the kid at 17 years old. So I'm concerned because I think literally on Tuesday or Wednesday, whatever it is, whenever we play Midfield, is going to be Welsh and Beaton. So that concerns the hell out of me. But in terms of Starfelt, Julian, really good. Depth below that, promising. But is that enough for Celtic? Do we need at least one more body that could be relied upon? Would be my question.
Mm-hmm. This is the Huddle Breakdown. We are the podcast that looks at the performance and analytics of Celtic. If you're watching the show or listening to the show for the first time, you can subscribe to our channel on Spotify. You can get us on iTunes as well, or you can follow us on Twitter. I do want to get to this comment coming in from Robert, and that's a question about the two right backs from Rennes. So we'll move on to the links that Celtic are being, the players that Celtic are being linked with at the minute, because there are a couple. There is rumours that Liel Abada is going to sign from Maccabi Tabah. at the end of the day, if not tomorrow. And then there's Brandon Soppy, a right back from Rennes, who's in his last year of contract with the French club as well. A 4 million transfer that's been rumoured. That seems to be more likely than the other rumour coming in about the other Rennes right back. I think that might be an agent trying to work his magic with that transfer. James, I know you've been looking at Brandon Soppy and Abada as well. So what type of players are there? Are they good enough for Celtic?
Well, again, all I can do is give you my view based off of the profile that I built. So I take it with a grain of salt. But I think there's definitely, as far as the fullbacks go, I'd say either seems to profile. And Soppy's 19. He's played limited, but he stayed at Rennes. With the limited amount of data that he had in the games that he played. He profiles fine. He's probably a little bit more developed on the ball playing side, which again is an inverted fullback. If that's the way that looks like we're going to be playing, that seems to fit. He's a decent size fullback. He's not Frimpong size basically, or a Taylor size. He's more,
I think he's 5'11", I think.
Yeah. So he's more of a, as I say, more of a European size, more of a European profile in that regard. So I think there's, a lot to like there. But he's 19. I mean, that's young. But I think that's probably also fits with what we're going to see with Ange. I mean, that's kind of the dictum coming in. I think also relates to the conversation on the center back side, and Yelda and Murray and, Welsh, is that he's more likely to, look at developing these people and giving them a pathway into the first team, where we've been horribly lacking in that for quite a while now. So Soppy and Bowie, I think I joked Baba Bowie last night, which is a Howard Stern reference from the United States in radio. But Bowie's the other guy. He's played a lot. He's 20. He played at Dion. Again, I always joke how horrible my linguistics are. Dion, is that it? Yeah. Dion, well over 2,000 minutes last year. So pretty good sample, but they were a terrible team. Which I actually found interesting in his data profile is that he put up a decent amount of creative passing for a team that was that bad. And particularly his crossing stats were really good. So I suspect he's really good at crossing. That doesn't make as much sense profile wise relative to what we've seen so far from an Ange. So I tend to agree with you. And my guess is that Soppy's still probably the main target. If there's a logical coherence based off of my assumptions here, which I might be wrong. Again, who knows? I don't know. It's still quite early as far as how Ange has been playing and what he's going to be doing. But the Israeli winger, I think, is a harder call. I think a lot of people kind of leapt to the Shved analogy, which I think's a little lazy. I think the big part there is because he's massively outperformed his XG, which was, and he's got an awesome highlight reel. So that's basically the extent of the Shved analogy. I think the issue there is that by all reports, he's extremely athletic and plays fairly aggressively. I don't see that translating in his data. I mean, I don't see things like, particularly for the position he's playing, I don't see it in dribbles. I don't see it in progressive runs, acceleration metrics. So he's not terribly creative. His crossing isn't, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of his data is kind of just okay or even below average for the sample profile that I put together for his peer group, which is basically, players in senior competitions that are kind of 20 and younger. So I wasn't comparing him to, Liverpool and Chelsea wingers. It was, or only, it was a large sample and of like players, and he just doesn't stand out really in any way other than his goal scoring record. And that, I think that's the anxiety, which is maybe he does have an outlier skill in shooting. It's possible. Or maybe he can get coached. He's so young. I think he's 19. Maybe this aggression and physical talent and speed that he has can be channeled productively to get more output. press more. I mean, he's like, things like his interception stats aren't there even for a winger as well. So there's just not a lot of output in event data that suggests that he's translating his athleticism to production, like I said, other than goal scoring.
Okay.
And so that can be developed. Maybe that's what Celtics see is a path to coaching that and putting him in a system that's going to highlight it. And that's certainly plausible. It's just from the profile I built, I don't see evidence of it yet.
It sounds a bit like the Henrik Mkhitaryan transfer to Manchester United. When he signed for United, he had some insane stats when it came to the Bundesliga the season before. Like I'm talking 25 odd assists along with 26 goals in his season. And then he came, and I'm not saying Mkhitaryan's a bad player. I'm just saying he wasn't that player. So this guy could be the greatest player to come out of the Israeli league in the last 10, 15 years, or he could be a pretty decent player who, maybe is not as good as his I'm going to say stats, but what I mean is the frontline stats as goals, assists, etc. He might not be as good as they suggest. So I'm going to hold fire until I actually see the guy if he does arrive at Celtic.
Absolutely. And to me, it's I can see a plausible scenario for the path of development for him because, again, I would think he's going to play behind Forrest, right? I'd be surprised if he's going to just come in and displace Forrest, or if that's the plan. So, if the scenario that I laid out, that they have identified someone who's got raw ability that they can coach, and that kind of fits with Iragidi too, by the way, and Shaw, right? So we've got one of the things from an analytics perspective it's all about is pattern recognition, right? So it's deducing patterns and learning things from patterns, whether it be in data or behavior. And so we've got a pattern forming here, which is fairly raw 19, 20-year-old players that have the athletic components that appear to be fertile, but maybe a little bit deficient on the skill side. And that's right for development. And we've got a manager who's got a track record of development. So that makes sense.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if it was under Neil Lennon, I'd be worried because are these players going to be coached? But under Ange, it seems like they actually are. Let's move on to the preseason games because Celtic have had 2 preseason games already. So we've played against Charlton Athletic and we've played against Sheffield Wednesday, and we're playing against Bristol City tonight at 7:30. I think that game is 2 wins from 2 so far. And there are patterns starting to emerge in the 2 games that we've actually played. Again, preseason games, can't judge too much on it. Do I believe that Celtic are going to be playing the same way in November as they're playing now? No, I don't. But there are obvious progressions in which Ange seems to look to improve the team. And Alan, what are your early thoughts of what you've been seeing?
Yeah, so just 1 second before we get into that, I just want to give you a little theory. It's not based on any inside information or what have you about the Israeli winger. Was it Abada?
Abada.
Yeah. Abada, sorry. I wonder actually if we're buying him as a striker, and the reason I say that is and I would ask James, how does he profile as a striker? Would that in that benchmark, what would his stats look like? Because he has played as a striker. His main attribute is goal scoring. If you think that we've got Forrest, and I think Forrest is going to be an absolute hit as far as Postecoglou is concerned in terms of how he wants his wingers to play. And then Dembele looks like he's going to get a chance. And if you think of the fact that we've actually, if you assume that Eduardo will be off, it looks like Griffiths is not long for this world. And obviously, we've got Ajeti. We've literally got 1 striker. So I'm thinking, what is the most logical answer to why are we signing this kid? And to me, it's to play him as a striker. So I'll just leave you with that thought. But again, it's just based on nothing more than, the old Sherlock Holmes maxim: if you don't know the answer, what's the most obvious kind of conclusion that you come to?
That's a great take, Alan. I love that. You just rocked my world. So I got to think about that.
All right, we'll get James to post that on the Huddle Breakdown Twitter page after this when he actually gets time to research it. So what about the preseason games then?
Yeah, preseason. So listen, maybe I'm choosing to be optimistic, and I am optimistic about Postecoglou. I don't have any real worries about him as an individual, as his credentials as a manager, his experience, his skills, his ability to improve teams, his clarity of vision, his clarity of communication, his ability to form bonds with the team. My concern is with the organisation around him, as we've talked about, right? So I'm maybe choosing to be a little bit optimistic, but I've been very pleasantly surprised by the 2 pre-season games that we've had, and especially the first half against Charlton. Because what I saw there was a relatively well realised and Ange Postecoglou team, and it looked like, if I had to bet, which I don't, it looked like pretty close to the team that will get played in next week, right? And the way, the intensity with which they played, the way that they bought into their individual roles for that 45 minutes, I thought was pretty impressive, actually. There was a lot of interesting things there. We mentioned Barkas and the fact that he was taking up a position literally on the halfway line between the centre backs, where Brown used to drop into. And essentially, what that means is you've now released a midfielder, which is, I mean, it doesn't sound much, but actually that makes a huge. That's one tiny little change makes a significant difference at your ability to control the game. And Postecoglou's teams are all about controlling the game. One of the people that impressed me most was Montgomery in terms of his movement off the ball and the way that he was inverting. So what I mean by that was you're letting the fullback, Taylor, go past him. He would move into midfield and create either an overload in the centre or vice versa, and Taylor would move into the centre, and Montgomery would form the left-sided attacking role. Because that actually, coming back to Abada, that's really where we're lacking. Apart from Johnston, we don't have a left-sided attacker, so that would desperately need somebody in that position as by the by. So that piece of it impressed me a lot, really. And obviously the midfield axis of McGregor, Sorrow, and Turnbull. I think by any standards, you would think that's a good midfield. And the ability to again recycle the ball, to be rotating, etc. Dembele again was cutting in, and a Jetty is what I was screaming for last season, who was given a role which wasn't to go out wide, wasn't to come too deep, it was to stay within the width of the 18-yard box and to get into the penalty area. And guess what? He looks a pretty dangerous striker because he is intelligent, his movement is good. His touch is fantastic. His finishing is very good. I think that it's just the fact that if he gets injured, and I think he got a knock in that game. It's just like, well, what the hell do we do now?
Yeah.
So very, very, very encouraged, I would say, by that particular that half. I would say, and I'm focusing on that half because I think that's where we saw a team that I think will be very close to the Midtjylland lineup, and a team playing in a way that I think is very close to how Postecoglou wants them to play.
Yeah, Jetty looks like he's sort of slimmed down a little bit as well, which is nice to see. Nice to see that he's coming into preseason in good shape. The Montgomery one's an interesting one. It's a really good point because if you think about Celtic over the last couple of years, it's been overlapping wingbacks crossing unsuccessfully most of the time into a box with players who are not necessarily all that good in the air. So if the fullbacks are actually playing inverted and creating space inside and bringing the ball inside into the box for low crosses and passes into the box, and that's going to be a much more effective way to play football with the group of players that we have. One question that has come in, and Scrafton Diamond is asking it, and it's someone that stood out for me in the preseason games as well, and somebody who didn't get a lot of game time last year rather, was Karamoko Dembele. He was really good, I think, against Charlton, especially in the first half that I seen, and looks like he shot up a bit as well. So is he a guy that you expect to be playing a bit more here, James?
I think it's very likely. I think that I'll go back 30 years to my days as a high school basketball player, right?
You're going back before I was born then.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to make you feel old.
F you, Enda.
It was all in black and white, Enda, in those days.
Yeah. Back to when all of these stat critics on Twitter who call me a virgin when I actually was a virgin. It takes me, watching Ange's system takes me back to that, because we ran what they call in basketball a motion offense, right? So basically you pass the ball a lot and it's all about cutting. It's cutting through the lane, dragging defenders out of position, because at that time, most teams were playing man-to-man at the high school level. So it creates space, and it's dynamic, and it doesn't really matter if you're a nominal, because look at me, I mean, I'm not 6'10", so I was playing power forward and center on a team at that time. And so you drag players out of space, and it's less about, your quote unquote position than it is the system. And to me, that's what it looks like his system is. His system is about fluidity. It's about fullbacks interchanging with midfielders, and whoever is on the ball, someone's making a run. I mean, every time, that first half was so enjoyable to watch, because every time there was a pass made, the guy was moving, and not moving in this aimless, kind of let me go find space. It was balls to the wall, cut, and putting pressure on defenders around them. And I think that Dembele, who cares how tall he is, right? It's how quick you are, how mobile you are, and how smart you are. And that certainly would fit with kind of the dynamics of the Japanese league as well. And if you looked at the Marinos teams that he had and how they played, I mean, some of the football was just amazing, and the cutting and, the crossing to players, making orchestrated, coherent cuts and run. They call it runs more so in football than cuts, but I mean, it's the same concept. It's the same principle. And that's where I get excited, because you get guys like McGregor. He's tailor-made for that. You get somebody like Incham, who could be an asset in hitting those cutters from deep. This is why I get back to how do you fit the pieces together. A guy like Beaton, who can hit a cutter from deep, right? So there's all these, I don't think we even fully grasp yet how these different pieces of the puzzle are going to fit together, and how explosive they could be once they're coherent, well drilled, and all firing. So I think a Dembele, absolutely. If anything, given his age profile and his quickness, again, Forrest's strengths are more of like a clear out player in basketball, more of a one-on-one, heads up beating a man. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but given he's slowing down, he's 30 now, is he going to fit as well into the system of that kind of cutting and explosive movement? That's where I'm very optimistic on Mikey Johnston, and how he'll fit into this. Even Bolingoli, if he ends up being rebirthed, we'll see, right? So you get some of these guys with the physical profile, think explosiveness as opposed to physicality. It's less, I think it's going to be less so about, getting muscled up, as opposed to, eat my dust, see you down the road kind of thing. And that we're going to blow by people more so than, wrestle through them.
Celtic scored 3 goals against Sheffield Wednesday. All 3 of them came from a high press, which was definitely a theme of these games, Alan. Liam Shaw, former Wednesday player, key role in this. I think I've been really impressed with Liam Shaw in the 2 games that we played so far. And he just seems to be a really quality player.
Well, yeah, we'll see. But I mean, so those of you who don't know, I live in Sheffield. So Wednesday, Sheffield United. I tend to frequent Bramall Lane, if I'm honest. I worked out that I hadn't been to Hillsborough since the 1996 European Championships, so that was not even to see Wednesday. But I do know a lot of Wednesday fans, obviously. So the general consensus was that Urhoghide really was potentially the gem. Shaw, they saw some great performances from. They also saw 2 sendings off, and a bit of recklessness, and a bit of a headless sort of chicken, I think was the thought. But again, in the context of playing in a desperately struggling team at the bottom of the championship, in a very, very physically tough league. So they're both 6'2", right? They're both big physical players. To James's point, I think we see that if the kid from Watford, Lowell, Peter Lowell's boy, if he signs, he's another big unit. So there's clearly something going on there around bulking up the athleticism of the side. These 2 boys absolutely add to that. Urhoghide, I think he had a bit of a skittish 45 minutes as a right back, because we don't frankly have anyone else to play there. And I think you can see his weaknesses are that ball progression, that running with the ball. He wasn't that comfortable. He wasn't comfortable playing out from the back. He loves defending, and I think in a centre centre-back position, he'd be different. With Shaw, again, he's played. The other thing with while Wednesday fans are a little bit, I couldn't get a sort of definitive answer from the ones I spoke to, was that he'd been moved around a lot. He'd played a bit at left back, he played centre back, he played centre midfield, he played as a 6. The kid had been moved around a lot, and he's only young. I think consensus was he's probably best suited to that midfield role. And I think what we saw in the game, especially against Wednesday, is that box-to-boxness, if you like, almost like sort of Joe Ledley, up and down, not necessarily particularly fast, but with Shaw, you've got the sheer length of stride means he covers the ground quickly, even if it doesn't look like he's running very fast. And actually, he's very aggressive, and he was closing the ball down. And we don't really have that in the midfield. Brown, obviously, as we know, we couldn't do that. It's not McGregor's game. Christie can do it, but not quite to the same. He's not quite as defensively focused as Shaw. So I think he's going to add something a little bit different in that regard. He looks a little bit ungainly. I'm not sure technically how good he is. Let's see. But I would say that I think he adds something the Celtic midfield, don't have at the moment. So that's got to be a good thing. And I think that's the one part of the team now. If we go back to talking about the squad and where are we with the rebuild, if you think about that midfield area with Soro, Shaw, Encham looks like he's back in the fold, and and Encham on his game is a real asset to Celtic. It really is. McGregor, Rogic, we were actually really well stocked in that one part of the field, so that'll be interesting. As I say, Shaw adds that little bit something different.
Yeah, it's interesting. The squad is definitely starting to take shape a little bit, which brings us along to the Champions League next week. A lot of people have been getting really skittish about the transfers and the need to get the transfers in before the end of the week. Personally, the transfers that come in this week probably aren't playing in that game anyway. I just don't see how somebody can come in on a Wednesday and play the next Tuesday for a team and a group of players that he's never played with, and for a manager whose style he's never played under. So I think we're currently working with the squad that we have. I think that's where we're going with Tuesday. So Alan, I'll give you the first shout before we finish up then. The FC Michelin game next Tuesday, how confident or otherwise are you?
No, I can't say I'm confident at all. I mean, again, you got to have sympathy, I suppose. Celtic are in this position where by the middle of July, they've got to have sorted a new team out every year. And, the rest of Europe, the rest of the marketplace doesn't march to that cadence. A lot of leagues don't start till September. So, it is hard. It's a really difficult environment to work in. All that being said, to me, there's an obvious solution, which is you get much of your business done in January or what have you, as you possibly can, and you give everyone 6 months to bed in. But anyway, let's move on. Midtjylland. So I'm not optimistic. This is going to be a very well coached team. They're a young team. I think there's 16 of their squad were born in the year 2000 or later. Just like so depressing, if you may.
That's young for me.
Yeah. They've got a sprinkling of Brazilians and Nigerians, so they're kind of tapping markets that are rich in terms of the amount of importable talent that they produce. They had their first foray into the Champions League last season. Now, they lost their first 4 games and then salvaged 2 draws in their last 2 games against probably weakened teams because the league was already sorted out. But they've got that experience under the belt. In terms of their style, they're actually going to play in a very similar way to how Postecoglou will play. They're going to play a very high press, very aggressive press. They're going to be, and when they lose the ball, they're going to retreat into a very compact low block. So there's going to be very, very limited space between their defence and the midfield out of possession. They're going to go back to a 4-5-1 out of possession. But when Celtic have got the ball, they're really going to put the pressure on. And they got a lot of joy against Liverpool playing that way. They tried to man up to Atalanta, who's James's sort of second favourite team, doing a very similar way. And actually, Atalanta got a lot of success against Midtjylland by bringing their fullbacks in, by rotating the fullbacks. The centre forward would drop deep. The centre midfielder would go into the centre forward position. They'd create little overloads in wide spaces, and they picked them apart pretty effectively. Atalanta, who are a really good side against Midtjylland when they played them that way. Again, they restrict their opponents to very low passes per defensive action. I think it was around about the 4 mark, which is pretty low. But they're also going to be very direct, right? They've got a striker, Kaba, who loves duels, right? He loves fighting for the ball. He can get involved in up to 30 duels a game. That's an insane number for a striker. So they're going to be they're like crosses, averaging in the Danish league over 18 crosses a game. So they're going to be banging the ball forward to this guy. They're strikers, and they're 3 midfielders that sit behind them in a 4-2-3-1. All four of those players have got over 0.5 goals and assists per 90 minutes last season. Kaba was 0.7. So the goal, the threat is all the way across that front line from the Danish player Dreyer, Sisto, the winger, Evander, who's a Brazilian, chipped in with a lot of goals as well. So, they average around 400 passes a game, which is quite low. Postecoglou, I think, once you get Celtic muttering, you're going to be looking at 600-700 passes a game. It just speaks to the directness that they're going to bring. What really concerns me is from a coaching element is for example when they played Liverpool in the Champions League. Now, admittedly, Liverpool played a bit of a second string even in the home game when it was still up for grabs, but they actually nullified Liverpool and they'd actually worked Liverpool out. They starved possession to the 2 fullbacks. They gave them nowhere to go. They pressed them high. Liverpool created nothing until they brought on Sané, Salah, and Firmino, and then they won the game in the second half, and then with a very late goal. So this is a team who's well coached, who will have a plan, although they probably don't know how Celtic are going to play because we don't know how Celtic are going to play. So I think we've got the element of surprise. That's I'll say that as a hope. But I think this is going to be a very well drilled team, and they're a team that is going to be some of the concerns that we've got about defensively, about defending high balls, about concerns about winning duels. Beaton, Welsh, I'm thinking of here, is going to be an issue for us. So and then if we're playing fullbacks like Ralston and Montgomery, and they're going to deploy a high press, and Ralston's not the quickest on his feet, we're not going to get the ball out, and we're going to get trapped. So these are the dangers that I see, really. But at the end of the day, this is a Danish team. They lost their Champions League games because ultimately they had the other teams had better players than them. I would expect Celtic players to be better, but I'd expect this team to be better organised and to have a plan.
I presume this is one of your favourite teams here, James, and an American owner who implemented the Moneyball system and turned things around.
So how dare you? So stereotype me like that. So that they've got the same owner as Brentford. And to put this into perspective, I think their wage budget is about 25% of Celtic's. So they're doing all this on 25% of Celtic's money. So they've been building this club since the acquisition. I think it was back maybe 5-6 years ago. And they've been building, meaning that it's been improving. This is not the team that Rangers beat in qualifying a couple of years ago. They've continued to improve and invest, and the model is probably where we're heading, hopefully, in a degree, only at scale because we have more resources, which is investing in youth, playing youth, giving them a path, and building a system that optimizes that athleticism of the youth, right? So if we were heading into facing this team last year, I would have been petrified given our profile last year and our vulnerability to athletic teams that have a good plan and could do damage. I'm actually a little more optimistic than probably the consensus going in for a couple of reasons. Number one is that quality gap, meaning that if Edouard does play, we still have some really talented players that probably are a notch above a lot of their players from a pure talent perspective. And at important positions like striker. So if we have a system that's really clicking, even a Jetty, I mean, if he's firing in a system that matters, he's a European level striker, as I think we've already started to see glimpses of. The defensive side's the real issue, the question. I think the athleticism that we're going to have in midfield now is going to make sure that that's at least competitive, and we're not going to be as much of a train wreck in transition as we were last season. So I think we could get through. I don't think it's crazy to think that we could get through. I think the variance on this tie is very high because it could be a wild one. You know, we could be seeing 4-3 type of games. I think that would be an unsurprising way that this unfolds, because if you look at Midtjylland and how they've played in Europe, they've had a number of those games because they do kind of come at people. They're not going in packing it in. They're going to be like a Bielsa Leeds team playing in the Premier League, right? They're going to go down in flames if they're going to go down. Or like an Atalanta, how they played against Liverpool, you know, lose 4-3 than 2-0. So you know, a little bit of luck, a little bit of variance. We're going to have young, fit players for the most part going in. We got some quality coming back. That's what I'm excited to see today. Are we going to see a Bowen goalie? Are we going to see an Encham? Are we going to see, I know Edouard took a knock. We don't know what's going on there. Maybe with some of the nonsense, potentially with contract negotiations, that could be a theoretical consideration going in. But, you know, so I'm cautiously optimistic. And what I mean there is I'm not defeatist. You know, I think we have a good shot here. I even think we have a good shot, a higher, I shouldn't say a good shot. That's wrong. I think we have a higher than consensus possibility of qualifying for Champions League even because of the variance that happens in these ties and how Postecoglou's style is one of variance, meaning that if we're going to be an underdog, which we very likely will be if we get past Midtjylland, a helter-skelter style lends itself to variance. And when you're the underdog, you want variance. You know, Ferencváros wanted variance, which is why Lennon's style of play didn't make sense in my mind relative to that, right? So when you're the underdog, you want a little bit of chaos. And so I don't think we have a 55 or 60% chance, but I think most people are a little bit more defeatist than is probably realistic. As far as particularly in this tie against Midtjylland. I mean, I think we have a good chance in the tie. Is it 50-50? Probably not. I mean, realistically, because of all the things that we're talking about. I mean, again, we can't be ridiculous about this. I mean, if you look at the backdrop of the transition and, you know, players new into a system, I mean, there's a lot that could go wrong here. But I see a recipe where, you know, it could go right. And I don't think that thinking that's plausible is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's hope so. Let's hope so that we can actually create something. One thing I'm optimistic about is the fact that, you know, they've got a new manager as well. So there's no guarantee that they'll be completely ready to play his style of play or completely adjusted to what he wants. So I mean that is something that does give me optimism going into it. I will be speaking to a Danish journalist ahead of that as well on the show. So I'll post that in the podcast network, the Huddle Breakdown as well. This has been the first Huddle Breakdown of the season. Alan, James, it's been great to be back. We hopefully will have some better football, some more successful football to talk about this year. If you've been watching the show on YouTube, thanks very much for dropping your comments below. You can subscribe to the channel and get notified every time we go live as well. That'll be pretty much every Wednesday for the next couple of weeks at least. And you can subscribe to the Huddle Breakdown podcast as well on iTunes or on Spotify as well. So it'll be on Spotify and iTunes and wherever else you get your podcast by the end of the night as well. So if you want to listen back to the show, that's where you can get us, or you can follow us on Twitter at Huddle Breakdown as well. But that is us for this week. So we shall chat to you next week. Good luck.